I just came from talking to the convention, and one of the things that I said to them was that for 20 years as an environmental advocate, I've been very disciplined about being bipartisan and nonpartisan in my approach to the environment. I've backed both Republicans and Democratic leaders who have good environmental records, including people like Chris Shays, Olympia Snow, Lincoln Chafee, John Chafee, my cousin Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's a good environmental record in California. And I don't believe that there's any such thing as Republican children or Democratic children. I think one of the worst things that can happen is if the environment becomes the province of a single political party. And 5 years ago, if you asked the major environmental leaders around the country to name the gravest threat to the global environment, they would have given you a range of answers, from global warming to overpopulation, habitat destruction. Today, they'll all tell you the same thing. It's George W. Bush. There's no way to speak honestly about the environment in any context without speaking critically about this president. They have, if you go to NRDC's website, you'll see 400 major environmental rollbacks that have been promoted by this administration over the past 3.5 years. If even a fraction of the ones that are current, and they've already done irreparable harm to both our global and local environment, if even a fraction of the ones that are currently being promoted are passed over the next 4 or 5 months, we will, by this time next year, effectively have no significant federal environmental law left in our country. That's not exaggeration. It's not hyperbole. It is a fact. Many of our laws will remain on the books in one form or the other, but we'll be like Mexico, which has these wonderful, poetic environmental laws, but nobody knows about them and nobody complies with them because they can't be enforced. And we're already seeing this, Americans all over the country without knowing it, because it's a stealth attack. The polling shows that 80% of the people, both Republican and Democrat, rank and file, want stronger environmental laws and want our laws strictly enforced. But the leadership, the Republican leadership in Congress and the leadership in the White House agrees with the 7% who think that we ought to have those laws weakened. And so under the advice of their pollster Frank Luntz, they've mounted a stealth attack. The American people don't know this is happening, that these laws are being eviscerated. They use euphemisms, like Orwellian euphemisms, like healthy forests and blue skies to disguise this very, very radical agenda where they're dismantling all of our laws. And the American people don't know it, but we are already suffering in many, many ways from this neglect and from this attack on our environmental laws. I'll give you a couple of examples. 6 months, just from one industry, the coal burning utility industry, which is really a single industry. About 6 months ago, the New York Times printed an article describing a survey that showed that 1 out of every 4 black children in New York now has asthma. I have 3 sons who have asthma. We don't know why we're having this epidemic of pediatric asthma now in our country. The asthma rates have doubled again over the last 5 years. We don't know why this is happening, whether it's hormones in our food or pesticides or antibiotics, something that's making the fetuses, the immune systems of fetuses, because children come out with this asthma, go awry. We don't know why it is. But we do know that asthma attacks are triggered primarily by 2 components of air pollution, ozone and particulates. And we know that the principal source of those components of air pollution, about almost 50% of it, is coming from 1,100 coal-burning power plants, who are just really a tiny handful of power plants who are violating the law, who are discharging those components illegally. The Clinton administration was prosecuting them. 75 of them were under either criminal investigation or civil investigation or direct prosecution. But this is an industry that contributed $48 million during the 2000 election cycle to the Republican Party and to George Bush, and they've given $58 million since. And one of the first things the Bush administration did when it came into office was to order the Justice Department and EPA to drop those lawsuits. This has never been done in American history before, where somebody under criminal investigation gives a campaign contribution to the president, and the president orders the case against them dropped. You remember what happened to Mark Rich, when President Clinton pardoned Mark Rich on his last day in office, and how the press went crazy, and the Republicans and everybody went crazy. There's one guy. This is 75 people who are breaking criminal laws, who are excused. And then the White House changed the Clean Air Act to favor these polluters, to rip the heart out of the Clean Air Act so that these factories will be able to discharge forever. I work on the New York City water supply, which is provides the finest. For 20 years I've worked on protecting the water supply. It comes from mainly from the Catskill Mountains. It provides New York with the finest drinking water of any municipality in the country. It accounts for the incomparable taste of New York City pizza, New York City bagels. That's why they can't be reproduced elsewhere. But that reservoir system has been protected from industrial development for over 100 years. But about 6 months ago, we learned that all of the fishes in the New York reservoir system are now contaminated with mercury, with so much mercury they're no longer safe to eat. I live 2 miles from the state of Connecticut. In Connecticut, it's now unsafe to eat any freshwater fish in the state because of mercury contamination. The same is true in 17 other states. 45 states have mercury warnings or advisories for at least some bodies of water. Well, there's no geological source of mercury in the state of Connecticut. That mercury is coming from those same coal-burning power plants for the most part in the Ohio Valley. And we know a lot about mercury that we didn't know 10 years ago. About 6 or 8 years ago, the CDC and the EPA completed a series of studies that were alarming, to say the least. They show, for example, that 1 out of every 6 American women of childbearing years now has so much mercury in her womb that her children are at risk for a grim inventory of diseases, including mental retardation, permanent cognitive impairment, liver disease, kidney disease, heart disease, and a bunch of other ones. I got my mercury levels tested recently, and they're so high just from eating tuna fish. And I talked to Dr. David Carpenter, who's the national authority on mercury at the university, State University up in Albany. And I said, what does it mean? And he said, if you were a woman of childbearing years and you had those levels in your blood, your children would have cognitive impairment, probably an IQ loss of 5 to 7 points, permanent. And I said, you mean might have? And he said, no, the science is very certain now. They would have cognitive impairment. And we now have 630,000 children born every year in this country to mothers who have put them at risk because of their dietary consumption of mercury, mainly fish, for all of those diseases. And the Clinton administration, reacting to this data, reclassified mercury as a hazardous air pollutant under the Clean Air Act, which triggered a requirement that those utilities remove 90% of the mercury within 3.5 years. The utilities, it would have cost the utilities about 1% of revenues. So that's a great deal for the American people. But it's still billions of dollars for the utility. But these are the same companies that contributed that $100 million plus to the president. And about 6 weeks ago, the Bush administration announced that it was scrapping those regulations and replacing them with regulations that on their face require them, give them 15 years to clean up, and they only have to clean up 40% of the mercury. But in truth, they're much worse than that, because the utility lobbyists who wrote that legislation wove in so many loopholes that they will literally never have to clean up the mercury. The regulations were written by a law firm that works for Southern Company and First Energy, some of the other utilities who were being prosecuted. And it was written verbatim by those law firms. The head chief lobbyist for that law firm is a man named Jeffrey Homestead, who's now the head of the air division at EPA. And he's the one who took the Latham and Watkins regulation, threw out the Clinton-era regulation, and substituted it. And this is what we're seeing throughout government, that the polluters are now running the agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. The second in command at EPA is a Monsanto lobbyist. The head of public lands in this country is a mining industry lobbyist. The head of the Forest Service is a timber industry lobbyist. And you go through Department of Agriculture, Department of Interior, Department of Energy, and EPA, and you'll see that the subsecretariats and the heads of the critical, virtually all of the regulatory agencies now come from the industry, the polluting industry that those agencies are supposed to regulate. I live about 2.5 hours south of the Adirondacks, and I take my children fishing and hiking, swimming, camping there. This is the oldest wilderness area on the face of the earth. It's been protected as wilderness since 1888. We had a right, the American people, to believe that generations of Americans would be able to enjoy those primal forests in pristine condition. But today, about a third of the lakes in the Adirondacks are now sterilized from acid rain. And this president, that's coming from those same power plants, this president has put the brakes on the statutory requirements that they clean up that acid rain. I flew over in May the Appalachian Mountains, and I saw a scene that if the American people could see it, there would be a revolution in this country. We are cutting down the Appalachian Mountains, these giant machines that are 22 stories high with a form of mining called Mountaintop Mining. The machines that are called draglines, they cost $500 million for a single machine. And with these colossal machines and 2,500 tons of dynamite that are exploded every day in West Virginia, they are leveling the mountain ranges. They knock off the top of the mountains and dump them into the adjacent river valleys and flatten out the landscape. They are stealing these lands. These lands that are the wandering place of Daniel Boone and David Crockett, and the source of our values, our virtues, our characters of people, the lands that give context to our community and grew our democracy in this country. We're cutting them to the ground. Now, this is illegal. You can't take rock and debris and rubble and toxic waste and dump them into the river in the United States of America. It's been illegal for half a century. It's been illegal since 1888, before even the Clean Water Act. But you need an EPA permit, and you can't get an EPA Clean Water Act permit to do that kind of activity. So we sued them, and we got an injunction from Judge Charles Hayden, the federal judge in West Virginia, against all mountaintop mining, 2 days from when we got that decision. The White House changed the federal interpretation of the Clean Water Act, 30 years of interpretation, to make it legal to dump solid waste, rock and debris, into water bodies all over our country. It doesn't just apply to mountaintop mining. And so now mountaintop mining is continuing unabated. And this is just one industry. And there's many other industries that have the same kind of power on Capitol Hill and are exerting the same kind of destructive force on our communities and our country. The hog industry is another one, corporate meat industry, and there's many, many others. And we are living today in a science fiction nightmare where my children, the children of millions of other Americans, can no longer enjoy the primal seminal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their father or mother and coming home and eating the fish, and where my children and the children of a million of other Americans who have asthma are gasping for breath on bad air days because somebody is literally stealing the air from their lungs. Somebody who's allowed to do that because they gave money to a politician. Because it's illegal to put the mercury in the fish and to put the poisons in the air. But they gave money to a politician, and they got that right to steal from the American people. And environmental advocacy is not about protecting the fishes and the birds for their own sake. It's about recognizing that nature is the infrastructure of our community, and that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children that provide them the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the landscapes that enrich us, and again, that provide context to our communities, and that unite us, that give us, that remind us of the shared experience of the 300 million Americans who share this land, who occupy these landscapes. Now, if you ask the people in the White House and Capitol Hill, the Tom DeLays of the world, why are you doing this? What they invariably say is, well, the time has come in our nation's history where we have to choose now between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what they've been urging us to do, what Dick Cheney and George Bush have been urging us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, to convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, to have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow, the illusion of a prosperous economy, but our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they're never going to be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And you know, this is one of the things I said at the convention tonight, is this is the administration of deficit spending. You know, they have taken the conserve out of conservatism. They have, you know, they've turned a $5 trillion surplus into a $5 trillion deficit by robbing future generations. And they've squandered the worst thing, you know, the respect that we had throughout the world. When I was a little boy, I traveled all over the world with my uncle, President Kennedy, with my father, and I saw these, I saw these like vast throngs of people that would greet us in Europe, and, you know, people around the world just adored our country. And we had the moral authority that we could wield around and they looked to us for leadership. And it took us 350 years in this country to build up those reservoirs of public respect and public adoration and love for the United States of America. And in 3.5 years, this president has destroyed those things. You know, he has stolen the best parts of our country. But the worst thing that they're doing is what they're doing in their environment. Polluting, you know, these policies that are stealing the air from our children's lungs, that are destroying our waterways, that are liquidating our landscapes for cash. And, you know, one of the other things that they love to say on Capitol Hill is that, well, we'll just get rid of the federal environmental laws, and we're going to return control of the states. And we'll have states' rights and community control, local control. And that, after all, is the essence of democracy. And the states are in the best position to patrol and police and protect their own environment. But the real outcome of that devolution will not be local control. It will be corporate control, because these large multinationals can so easily dominate the state political landscapes. And, you know, we remember in the Hudson Valley, the 1960s version of community control, before we had these federal environmental laws, when this tale can be told 10,000 times across this country in virtually any community, where the General Electric Company came into the Hudson Valley, and they were the big culprit in the Hudson, and they came into these towns, the same as in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. John DeVillers is the guy who got them to clean up that mess on the Housatonic. But they came into these poverty-stricken upstate towns at Fort Edward and Hudson's Falls, New York, and they said to the town fathers, we're going to build you a spanking new factory. We're going to bring in 1,500 new jobs. We're going to raise your tax base. And all you have to do is waive your environmental laws and let us dump our toxic PCBs in the Hudson River. And if you don't do it, we'll move to New Jersey. And we'll do it from across the river, and you'll still get the PCBs, but they'll get the jobs and the taxes. And Fort Edward and Hudson's Falls took the bait. And 2 decades later, General Electric closed the doors on those factories, fired the workers, and they left the Hudson Valley with their pockets stuffed with cash. The richest corporation in the history of mankind. And it's, you know, largely pollution-based prosperity. They got more Superfund sites than any corporation in the world as well. And they left behind a $2 billion cleanup bill that nobody in the Hudson Valley can afford. And I have 1,000 commercial fishermen, my clients, who are now permanently out of work, because although the Hudson is loaded with fish, the fish are still loaded with General Electric's PCBs, and they're too toxic to legally sell in the market. And the barge traffic on the Hudson is dried up because the shipping channels are too toxic to dredge. And all of that, you know, beautiful shoreline property, the best property in those towns that was given to General Electric with tax breaks from the grateful localities is now permanently off the tax rolls, robbed from those communities as a source of revenue or recreation. And every woman between Oswego, New York, and Albany has elevated levels of PCB in her breast milk. And everybody in the Hudson Valley has General Electric's PCBs in our flesh and in our organs. My own levels of PCBs are double or almost triple the national levels. And what the federal environmental laws were meant to do was to put an end to that kind of corporate blackmail and to stop these corporations from coming in and whipsawing one community in New York against against another in New Jersey or one in Massachusetts against another New Hampshire to get them to race to bottom, to lower their environmental standards, to recruit these filthy industries in exchange for the promise of a few years of pollution-based prosperity, and to ransom their children's futures in the process. And what the federal laws did is they democratized our country. They gave us local control, the same as the federal civil rights laws gave people local control. With these laws, and Charlie Lord knows this, you have the most vulnerable American citizen, the most alienated American citizen, has the right to say, when the big shot comes into your backyard and says, we want to put a hog factory in your backyard, or a plastics plant or an incinerator, you have the right to say, wait a second, I want to see an environmental impact statement, a cost-benefit analysis of what your project is going to do to my community over the long term. And I want to have a hearing on that. And I want to I want the right to examine witnesses and to bring my own witnesses. And I want a transcript, a judicial decision, or decision based upon a rational interpretation of that transcript, and the right to appeal it judicially. And we have that right now in this country because of those federal laws which democratize our country so much. And if government doesn't sue a polluter, which they almost never do, like a lawbreaker who's breaking the law and stealing from the public, then I want the right to sue them myself. And we have that right to step into the shoes of the United States Attorney and prosecute these polluters for penalties and injunctive relief. And, we have these right-to-know laws and toxic inventory laws that make industry and government transparent on the local level and that have democratized our country in this extraordinary way. And I want to say, one other thing along these lines, which is that there's no stronger advocate for free market capitalism than myself. I believe that the free market is the most efficient, democratic way to distribute the goods of the land. But in a true free market economy, and I'll say this, the best thing that could happen to the environment is if we had true free market capitalism in this country, because the free market creates efficiency. And efficiency means you eliminate waste, and waste is pollution. So if you want to get rid of pollution, you want the free market. But we don't have the free market in America anymore. I talked to Jim Hightower the other day, and he said the free market is a great thing. We should try it sometime. But you can't name me an industry that there's a free market left. There's no free market in agriculture in this country. You can't raise a pig and bring it to a slaughterhouse and bring it and sell it on the marketplace. We don't have a free market in the energy sector. It's all subsidized. $65 million a year to the oil industry and the coal industry and nuke. They're all subsidized, and they're all subject to these terrible destructive market distortions. And now we're getting rid of Main Street. We're bringing Walmart in that's emptying out Main Street, and destroying our country. They're public enemy number one in the United States of America. But in a true free market economy, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. You show me a polluter. You show me a polluter, and I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat who's using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. When the coal industry and utilities poison our fish with mercury and destroy the capacity for our kids to breathe. And just those companies that were being prosecuted, those 75 companies, those companies kill just the exceedances from those companies, according to EPA, kill 5,500 Americans every single year. Those 1,100 utilities kill 30,000 Americans every single year. This is real crime we're talking about. We're talking about child abuse. We're talking about theft. We're talking about killing people. That's what they're doing. They're breaking the law and they're killing people in the process. And when they make our children gasp for air, or they cause 250,000 asthma attacks every year, and that takes people out of work, etc. Those impacts are imposing costs on the rest of us that should, in a true free market economy, be reflected in the price of General Electric's product when it makes it to the marketplace, or of the coal industry's product. General Electric's another good example. When General Electric avoided the costs, when it dumped its PCBs into Hudson, it was avoiding one of the costs of bringing its product to market. which was the cost of properly disposing of a dangerous processed chemical. Well, when it avoided those costs, it was able to outcompete its competitors, and it was able to enrich its shareholders and board, but the cost didn't disappear. It went into the fish, and it put the men out of work, and it made the people sick, and it dried up the barge traffic, and it took the land off the tax rolls. And all of those impacts impose costs on the rest of us that should, in a true free market economy, be reflected in the price of General Electric's product when it makes it to the marketplace. But what GE did, and what the coal industry does, and what every polluter does, is they use political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay their production costs. And what all of the federal environmental laws were meant to do was to restore free market capitalism in America, to force polluters to pay the true cost of bringing their product to market. And I don't even consider myself an environmentalist anymore. I consider myself a free marketeer. I go out into the marketplace and I catch the cheaters, and I say to them, this is what Charlie Lord does too, is we say to them, we are going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because when somebody cheats the free market, they are distorting the entire marketplace. And none of us gets the benefits of the efficiencies and the democracy that the marketplace otherwise promised our country. And of course, you know, this conference is about you know, environmental justice, and and all of these issues are about environmental justice. But you know, the fact is that when we cheat the free market, the cost of those subsidies and the destructive impacts of those subsidies always land disproportionately on the backs of the poor. 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in America is in a black neighborhood. The largest concentration of toxic waste dumps in America is in Mobile, Alabama, which is 85% black. The highest concentration of toxic waste dump in America is the south side of Chicago. The most contaminated zip code in our country is East LA. Navajo youth have 17 times the rate of sexual organ cancer as other Americans because of thousands of tons of toxic uranium tailings that have been dumped on their reservation land. And there's 150,000 Hispanic farm workers that are poisoned by pesticides in this country every year, and God knows what's happening to their children, because nobody's out there taking those measurements, but they're bringing that stuff home. But it's not just the poor who get hurt, it's all of us, because we own these resources. That's what the law says. The law, the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts says the people of the state own the waterways of the state. They own the air of the state. Everybody has a right to use them, and they own the fisheries. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody has a right to use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. This is ancient law. It goes back to Roman times. It's in the Code of Justinian. It's in the Magna Carta. You know, it's called the Public Trust Doctrine. And what it says is those assets that are not susceptible to private ownership, that by their nature are part of the commons, are part of the public weal, that those are owned by the people. And in ancient Rome, if you were a citizen, whether you were rich or poor, humble or noble, African, European, whatever, you had an absolute right to cross a beach with a net, throw in the net in the water and take out a fish, as long as you didn't take more than your share. That's what the law was. The emperor himself could not stop you, because these were public trust assets, and that was sacred. And I'll just give you a quick history lesson, which is during the Dark Ages, Roman law collapsed in Europe. And the feudal kings and nobles of Europe began reasserting control of the public trust assets. For example, King John said that the deer now belong exclusively to the nobility, not to the people. That's what got him in trouble with Robin Hood. He also erected navigational tolls on the rivers, the Thames and the other rivers of England, and he began selling monopolies to the fisheries, taking them away from the public. The public, in reaction to that, rose up, they confronted him at the Battle of Runnymede, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which was the first expression of constitutional democracy and the birthplace of our Bill of Rights. It contains virtually all of our Bill of Rights in some form, in an early form, but it also contains 2 chapters, one on free access to fisheries and one on free access to navigable waters. And those rights descended to the people of the states when we had the revolution in this country, and we still enjoy those rights. The modern environmental laws were not giving us new rights. They were simply restating rights that were very, very old and that had been eroded and stolen from the American people during the Industrial Revolution. And I want to say, make one other kind of broad point, which is that the reason that we protect the environment is not for the sake of the fishes and the birds. It's for our sake. Because nature enriches us. It enriches us economically, yes. It's the base of our economy, and we ignore that at our peril. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, but it also enriches us aesthetically and recreationally and culturally and historically and spiritually. And human beings have other appetites besides money. And if we don't feed them, we're not going to grow up. We're not going to become the beings that our Creator intended us to become. When we destroy nature, we diminish ourselves. We impoverish our children. And this is something that's really important for Americans to understand, and particularly New Englanders, because, you know, from the beginning of the colonial period, our cultural leaders and spiritual leaders and political leaders were telling the American people, you don't have to be ashamed because you don't have the 1,500 years of culture that they have in Europe, because you have this relationship to the land, and particularly to wilderness, which is the undiluted work of the Creator. And that's the source of your values and your virtues and your character as a people. And, you know, and if you look at throughout our history, all of the, you know, all of the kind of cultural accoutrements have echoed that theme. Our great writers from New England, or Melville, and, you know, and Hawthorne, and Emerson, and Thoreau, and Washington Irving, and from all over the country, Jack London, Mark Twain, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway. The unifying theme in every valid piece of classic American literature is that nature is the critical defining element of American culture. The first great books that we produced in this country were the first bestsellers in Europe were the Leather Stocking Tales. The Last of the Mohegans, and the Deerslayer and the Pathfinder, you know, these were by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and these were stories about this guy Natty Bumppo, who is a creature of the American wilderness, and he has all of the virtues that the European romantics associated with the American woodland. He was courageous, and he was a crack shot, and he was self-reliant and independent, and he had integrity and honesty. And the reason they loved him in Europe, not because it was good writing, it was atrocious, but because they believed that there really was a new race being melded out of the American wilderness. And a generation after that, we made him a bestseller in this country because we believe that about ourselves. And a generation after that, you have Emerson and Thoreau come along, who've kicked off the trace of the European heritage, and they embrace nature as the spiritual parent of all Americans. They say, if you're an American and you want to hear the voice of God, you've got to go into the forest and listen to the songs of the birds and the rust of the leaves. If you want to see the American soul, you have to look into the mirror of Walden Pond. And our poets, Whitman Frost, Emily Dickinson, Robert Service, our artists, we have two great defining schools, which is, should I shut up now? Okay, two more minutes, okay? But we have two defining schools of art in our country. One is the Hudson River School, which is Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, Samuel F.B. Morris, Cropsey, Bierstadt, and the Western School, Remington and Russell. And they all painted these stark, indomitable landscapes, El Capitan and the Sierra Nevada, you know, Storm King Mountain and the Hudson Valley, where I come from. And you know, the most sort of indomitable. And there's other schools of art that painted nature. And you know, the American artists painted the landscape so large that any kind of evidence of humanity was like ant-like and in ruins. The other nations, like Europe, you know, the European artists have also painted nature, but, you know, the French and Italian have their garden and agrarian scenes, the British have their still lifes, but that's nature tamed. In our country, they painted nature in its wildest form because that's the way they wanted to capture the American soul. Even our language is taken from nature. Emerson pointed out that if we were raised on a moonscape, our language would likewise be barren, because so many of the words and terms we use in common usage are drawn from nature. And if you talk to Aboriginal people, or if you go back in time, language becomes more and more picturesque, until if you go all the way back, it becomes poetry. It's just a series of symbols, all of them taken from nature. And Emerson pointed out that every word that we have in the English language that expresses a moral fact or a spiritual fact is taken from nature. The word right is taken from a word that means straight. The word wrong is taken from a word that means gnarled or twisted. The word spirit is taken from a word that means wind. The word supercilious means raised eyebrow, and so you can go through a dictionary and make those comparisons. But this was a connection that's been recognized and exploited by our great spiritual leaders and moral theologians in every religious tradition throughout the history of mankind, who use allegories and parables and fables taken from nature to teach us the difference between right and wrong, to teach us what the face of God looks like. Whether it's the ancient pagan philosopher Aesop, the modern Christian theologian C.S. Lewis, and everybody in between, Confucius, Buddha, the Upanishads of Hinduism, The Quran, where all of the prophets come out of the desert, and all of them are shepherds, and that daily connection to nature and wilderness gives them a special access to the wisdom of the Almighty. The same is true in the Old Testament. All of the prophets come out of the wilderness. And the seminal events are the Garden of Eden, which is a mandate for stewardship, and Noah's Ark, which is a mandate for biodiversity. God didn't say to Noah, just bring 2 of every creature that can demonstrate a current economic value. He said, bring them all on board, because they're good, because I made them. And the New Testament, where Christ is born in a manger, surrounded by animals, and that's not an accident, and where he discovers his divinity for the first time while he's spending 40 days in the wilderness. And incidentally, the central epiphany in every religious tradition in the history of mankind always occurs in the wilderness. Buddha had to go into the wilderness to experience self-realization and nirvana. Muhammad had to go up into the wilderness of Mount Hira in 629 and wrestle an angel in the middle of the night to have the Quran squeezed out of him. Moses had to go into the wilderness of Mount Sinai to get the commandments. The Jews had to spend 40 years in the wilderness wandering to purge themselves of the 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And Christ had to go into the wilderness to discover his divinity. And his mentor was John the Baptist, a man who lived in the cave in the Jordan Valley and dressed in the skins of wild beasts. And all of Christ's parables are taken from nature. He said, I am the vine, you are the branches, the mustard seed, the little swallows, the scattering the seeds on the fallow ground, the lilies of the field. He calls himself a fisherman, a farmer, a vineyard keeper, a shepherd. The reason he did that was that's how he stayed in touch with the people. He was saying things that contradicted everything that they had heard from the literate, sophisticated people of their time. And they would have dismissed him as a quack. But they were able to confirm the wisdom of his parables through their own observations of the fishes and the birds. And they were able to say, he's not telling us something new. He's simply illuminating something very, very old, some messages that were written into creation at the beginning of time by the Creator. And we haven't been able to decipher them until the prophets came, who live in the wilderness and understand them from studying them. And that's why all the religious traditions urge us to study nature, because that's where the messages of God are written. And we're not protecting, in this country, in this environmental movement, those ancient forests in the Pacific Northwest, as Rush Limbaugh loves to say, for the sake of a spotted owl. We're preserving those forests because we believe the trees have more value to humanity's standing than they would have if we cut them down. And I'm not fighting for the Hudson for the sake of the shad or the sturgeon, the striped bass, but because I believe my life will be richer, my children, my community will be richer. If we live in a world where there are shad and sturgeon and stripers in the Hudson, and where my children can see the fishermen in their tiny little boats, doing what they've been doing for generations, 350 years, and touch them when they come to shore to repair their nets, to wait out the tides, and connect themselves in that way to 350 years, 3 centuries of New York State history, and understand that they're part of something larger than themselves. They're part of a continuum. They're part of a community. I don't want my children to grow up in a world where there are no commercial fishermen on the Hudson, where it's all, Unilever in these 400-ton factory trawlers 150 miles offshore, strip mining the ocean with no interface with humanity, and where there are no family farmers left in our country, where it's, Smithfield and Cargill and premium standard farms, these multinational criminal corporations raising animals in factories, and where we've lost touch with the seasons and the tides and the things that connect us to the 10,000 generations of human beings that were here before there were laptops, and that connect us ultimately to God. And I don't believe that nature is God, or that we ought to be worshiping it as God, but I do believe that it's the way that God communicates to us most forcefully. And God talks to human beings through many vectors, through each other, through organized religion, through the great books of those religions, through wise people, and through art and literature and music and poetry, but nowhere with such force and detail and clarity and grace and texture and joy and love as through creation. We don't know Michelangelo by reading his biography. We know him by looking at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And we experience the divine when we're out in nature, experiencing the portrait that God drew for us out there. And, so for me, when we destroy these things like the Charles River, which is, we're a maritime community. When we can't swim in the Charles and you've robbed that from the community, or stole it, we're imposing a cost on ourselves that I don't think is prudent. and we're stealing something from our children, which I don't think we have the moral right to do. And that's really all that environmental advocacy is about. It's about recognizing that we have an obligation to the next generation. And that obligation is expressed by the term, and to the poorest members of our community, the other people who don't participate in the political process, but nevertheless, they still own a piece of that public trust asset. A child, born in New York to a black family has a right to breathe, no matter how much some coal baron in the Midwest is making from poisoning him. He doesn't have that right. He has a right to come into a world where the air is clean enough for him to breathe, and the water is clean enough for him to drink, and where he can enjoy the landscapes and the river systems of our country. And that's what, that's what the term sustainability means, is that we have an obligation to the next generation and to the other members of our community who don't participate in the political process to preserve these assets for them. And, and that doesn't mean that we can't use the assets, but we can't cut down the mountain to get at the coal. We can't drain the pond to get at the fish. We have an interest, we have an obligation to live sustainably, to preserve the capital. We can live off the interest. We can't go into the capital. And what we do, Charlie Lord and I do, as environmental advocates, is we elbow our way into the courtrooms and into those back corridors of Capitol Hill and in the state capitals where the big shots are, where Monsanto and Peabody Coal and Premium Standard Farms and Smithfield Foods are back there with their indentured servants in our political process, cutting up the pie that belongs to you and me, the air, the water, the public trust assets, and the wildlife, the wandering animals, and they're liquidating them for cash and stuffing their pockets. And we elbow our way into those cabals and we say, we are emissaries for the future and we demand an accounting. We want to know what you're doing with things that don't belong to you, with things that belong to our children. And I'll close with a proverb from the Lakota Indians that's been expropriated to some extent by the environmental movement, where they said we didn't inherit this planet from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And I would add to that that if we don't return to our children something that is roughly the equivalent of what we received, that they'll have the right to ask us some really difficult questions. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Charlie, for having me.